Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Gary Saul Morson, who is professor of the arts and humanities at Northwestern University, and Morton Schapiro, who is the president of Northwestern University and a professor of economics at Northwestern. Welcome, Saul and Morty.
We're so glad to be here.
Thank you, Gil. As we know, you're a Northwestern alum and a Northwestern parent, so it's even a greater honor than normal to be on your podcast.
We have a true Northwestern bias in this conversation, so I'll put that out there for audience to digest. Our conversation today is about your latest book, Minds Wide Shut: How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us. In which you say polarization may be pushing democracy to the breaking point, but few have explored the larger interconnected forces that have set the stage for the crisis, namely a rise in styles of thought across a range of fields, you say. And that's what you call fundamentalism or fundamentalist. So do you have a crisp definition for it? Saul, I'll start with you.
Well, yes, we did define the term, not in the sense that we want to regulate it forever, just to make clear how we are using the term. You can use it in lots of different ways legitimately. We are trying to identify a style of thought that the most important characteristic is a closure to counter evidence. You simply know what the truth is, and everyone else who thinks differently has to be wrong. You know that in advance. Nothing will ever shake you. There are a couple of other characteristics as well. Sometimes there's the sense that the truth is perfectly clear. You know exactly what it is because who could not see this? In the original meaning with religious fundamentalism, that is because you have the notion that the Bible's meaning is absolutely on the surface and perfectly clear. So that's why you take it literally. But it doesn't have to be that. There's just this conviction that, well, I'm a scientist, and if you don't see it, you're just scientifically illiterate. That's all. That's that sense. And the third would be probably the least important, but still significant, is that there's a sense that there is a founding or important text, which can't be wrong, which you revere. Very often you don't even read it, but the way people don't read the Bible. In the Soviet Union, it was, the classics of Marxism, Leninism. They simply, if physics contradicted it, physics was wrong. You just knew it right there. So those would be basically the three characteristics. They tend to go together, as you can see, because all of them imply absolute certainty.
Yeah, so I want to push on that a little bit. So that is sort of the foundational characteristic, right? So you have a set of beliefs that appear sort of deterministic, that appear concrete, and anything that sort of goes against that should be wrong. And so any sort of experimentation, empiricism, any sort of emerging data would not be valid, right?
Yes, you know in advance that it can't be. Um, so if people do disagree, it could only be because they are evil and guided by nefarious motives, or simply too stupid to understand. Those are the only possibilities open to you. And so, if evidence seems to contradict it, there's something wrong with the evidence.
Yeah. So Morty, I know that we're going to talk in detail about the economics aspect of it, but so what, from your perspective, what is sort of the foundational characteristic of a fundamentalist?
Well, I just to follow up on the conversation so far. I mean, I think it comes down to whether you believe something that is open to contrary evidence. The great philosopher of science, Karl Popper, said, of course, your view should be falsifiable, right? And if you believe something in your heart and soul and no evidence can possibly dissuade you, that is a fundamentalist belief. And I think we all have some. It's important to recognize the fundamentalism in each of us, but we should also probably minimize the percentage of all of our deeply held feelings that are not falsifiable.
Yeah. So when I was reading the book, I was wondering, this seems a fairly common characteristic. We got 8.3 billion people. Um, I don't know, conservatively, I would say maybe 6 to 6.5 billion of them are fundamentalists by definition. So there has to be some sort of a survival benefit to being fundamentalist, do you think?
Well, I would just say that, push back a second. I mean, I think we're all, if there are 8 billion people in the world, there are 8 billion fundamentalists. It just depends on, are we a fundamentalist in everything we believe? So I happen to be an observant Jew. I believe in a benevolent God. And, the atheists could, scream at me all they want. And I don't care. That's who I am. And that's a belief I have. Saul believes in the existence of great literature as exemplified by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. And, all the deconstructionists and the modern theorists could all say, no, it's all relative and all that. And Saul's going to say, you cannot convince me that I'm wrong. But I think the important thing is that while we all have some fundamentalist views that define who we are, I think we should be open for debate on the vast majority of other views. And, that's the sort of what underlies democracy, that we might be wrong and that we're open to contrary evidence. So I think we're all fundamentalists, but we shouldn't all only be fundamentalists.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, as I was growing up in South India, Saul, debate was a debate was prevalent. There is a way to debate, and the English culture of debating, take the counterparty's ideas. You can show why that could be wrong. There is an art of debate,
Mm-hmm.
but we seem to have lost it, right?
Yes. I mean, to be a good debater, you have to really understand the other point of view, which means you have to be able to paraphrase it in such a way that a believer in it would accept the paraphrase as valid.
Yeah.
If you only listen to, if you're in a silo, you only hear people on your side who describe the other people as, evil or stupid. You don't hear what makes them believe in it. The line I like so much from John Stuart Mill is, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. You really, if you don't know the arguments against your position, you're believing it the way one would believe in the grossest superstition, right? But unless you sort of open yourself to that, and people are increasingly not doing it, they live in silos, they never hear, they cut out the other point of view, before they even hear it. Well, then really you are believing like the grossest superstition, your points of view, even when they're right.
Yeah. But how did we get here? Both of you have been long-term educators. Um, you know, generally education has been increasing worldwide. So how did we get into the situation that we are unable to take the counterpoint and refute it in a logical fashion? Do we not teach that in education institutions?
Well, I think some teach it more effectively than others, but I think one difference for the way I grew up here, and I don't know your experiences in South India, but it was really hard to live in a silo or in an echo chamber, if you will. I mean, we watched everybody together. Most Americans watched the nightly news, and whether you watch Dan Rather on CBS or Tom Brokaw on NBC or Peter Jennings on ABC, or before that Walter Cronkite and his peers. Um, it wasn't like we watched because we're really conservative. We're going to just stick to Fox News, or we're really liberal. We're going to watch MSNBC or CNN. And it wasn't, we read the paper. There was more of a common understanding of what was real and what was not. Yeah, it was true that I liked Newsweek more than Time, because Time was a little bit more conservative, but it wasn't the echo chambers that we live in now. And I think that with the development of social media and with changes in communications and technology over the last couple of decades, it's become very comforting, just to turn on, read what echoes your feelings, or watch what echoes your feelings, and it doesn't challenge you. So I think maybe when you grew up in South India, you debated because there was more of a common understanding of what was going on in the world than there is now. And when you grow up with, it's comforting to be in an echo chamber. You feel better about yourself, but I think you do yourself a disservice, and I certainly think you do democracy a disservice.
Yeah. So Maury, I want to ask you this. So, um, is it choice that gives us segmentation schemes? So, for instance, suppose there is only one news service, and everybody listens to that news service, and then you say it's a binary choice. I'm going to agree or disagree. You get debate. But let's say we have four different news services, and then you self-select into four buckets. And then once you're in the bucket, you never get out. So is it choice that led us here?
Well, going back, Saul would say about the former Soviet Union, if you only have one news service, it better be an honest one, right? So that's a little risky, isn't it? But if that one service is the BBC, or if it's something like that, then maybe you can live with it. But, I'm an economist. Economists love choice sets.
Yeah.
Um, but, you asked about what's different, and I think it's the communications and technology, revolutions of recent generations that have allowed us to avoid, any thought we don't agree with. And I think that is very polarizing, and it's polarizing not just in politics, but in economics and in the academy and literature, and certainly in religion. And I don't know what you say, Saul, but you're always asking. It's a great question. What happened that put us into this situation where everybody's screaming at each other and no
Yeah.
one's listening? And the idea of debate is, win at all costs, not learn from each other. And I have to say, I think it was, a lot of these. It's a proliferation of silos that many of us live in. And one of the recommendation, and we've been given a series of book talks, and I keep saying to my liberal friends, have you ever watched Fox News? And they say, no, 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 it's the devil. And I say, well, what do you think they say about CNN? I said, watch it. I do. I watch a little of it every day. And I'm not talking about when the anchors come on at night and screaming and all this stuff, but I'm talking about most of, during the day. They present the news with a conservative bent, but I recognize it as the news. And even if I'm not convinced, it helps me understand why half of Americans, voted for then President Trump, and then almost as many or more, but almost half voted for him again after the job that he did. So it gives me some understanding of why people believe, have a very different view of what the world's like.
Yeah. So also, there appears to be a self-selection bias. And once you self-select into a club, you are in that club. You don't, the club has no windows. It's actually a waste of time to look outside the window, right?
Yes, I mean, I remember something happening here approximately, I can't give you an exact time, 20 years ago, when I would talk to people, in our wonderful journalism school, and there was a kind of switch from the idea that our job is to be as fair to all sides as possible and presented, to our job is to be social advocates for our point of view.
Yeah.
And that happened about 20 years ago. And the same thing, of course, is now happening on the news. What Morty was talking about back when it was, Walter Cronkite and, Peter Jennings, there was at least an attempt, to present it in such a way that, you could hear both points of view, even if you favored one of them, right?
Right.
And that, what's happened now is that isn't the case anymore, right? And so that's why even then, if you listen, let's say, to a liberal news broadcaster, you had a sense of what the conservatives were saying, or the centrists were saying, and vice versa. But that's not true now. You have not a clue. I mean, I have colleagues who, who will say things like, "Oh, that awful Wall Street Journal that hates immigrants." Well, if they'd been reading it, they'd know for 30 years or 40 years, the Wall Street Journal is a highly pro-immigrant newspaper because they believe, free markets and immigrants are free labor markets. I mean, they have no problem with it. They're in favor of it. They won't lose it. And yet you hear people characterize it. They know in advance what the Wall Street Journal has to be saying because they're bad guys, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so going back to this fundamentalist criteria you have here. So the first criteria you have is certainty. You call it negative fundamentalism. So Maury, why do you mean by certainty?
Well, I think again, there's no reason for debate if you know the truth. So you might humor someone, but you're not going to be open to reconsider your views. And I mean, I think that's, again, I'm certain about certain things, and one of the early reviewers of the book had a great line that we've now learned. Saul, I don't know if one of our interviews, somebody looked it up, and there's a history to this line, but I didn't know it until she shared it with me, that you want your mind to be wide open, but not so wide open that your brain falls out. And I think that's a great line. There's some areas where you want your mind wide shut, but not too many areas. And I think, there are certain beliefs I have about the economy and about other things, and faith I mentioned before, that, I'm not ready to debate. I'm not interested in any facts that can possibly change my mind. But there are a lot of other things that I am open to learning from people who know more about subjects than I do. And I want to see the evidence, and, I want to see if I was wrong. But, you don't put everything on the table, because if you put everything on the table, then who are you?
Yeah, so let me push on this a little bit, Maury. So at Kellogg and other business schools around the country, when you get an MBA, you are taught capital asset pricing model. You are taught NPV. You have your Excel spreadsheets where you have deterministic cash flows. You have a discount rate, and you are taught that if you have a positive NPV project, you take it. Otherwise, you leave it. There is no business in the world who does that. And so why do we teach that?
Well, I think, sometimes you teach everybody knows that the world is a much more complicated space than what you do with a simple mathematical model. But usually the simple mathematical model has some value that, in our previous book, Sense and Sensibility, we talked about that great length. You look at the neoclassical model, not just in finance, but more generally in the field of economics. And it makes some very unrealistic assumptions, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn a lot from it. And then, when you're teaching MBAs, I began my career teaching teaching finance at Wharton all those decades ago. And, these are people who had come from, many of them from investment banking. I came from grad school immediately, right? So they knew more about the real world, but I felt like teaching them a little math and teaching them about efficient frontiers and the like, they can apply it. And I think most of them do. Otherwise, they wouldn't keep paying for MBAs.
Yeah, so I was thinking this idea. So in physics, we made a big transition from Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics, and it made many people very, very uncomfortable, and still continues to be. Newtonian mechanics, as you know, works most of the time, but it doesn't in specialized domains. And the idea of determinism, I wonder, is a characteristic that we're imposing on students from an education perspective. So when they come out, they want certainty. Anything that shows uncertainty or flexibility seems sort of countercultural. Do you think that is true from an education perspective?
Well, I'm curious what Saul says, but I don't think we impose it. I think that they come to us wanting it. And, Saul and I teach this popular undergraduate class. We've done it 11 years in a row, over 1,200 students cumulatively. And, we do get people who write on course evaluations. Why don't you ever give us the answer? Why are you always debating? Why do you then ask us to write an essay on what you think? Well, because, learning how to learn and is the most important outcome of higher ed. I don't think learning the formula for the rule of 72 or something, yeah, we do it, the Coase theorem, we do it, but we do it in a way so that people then can apply in the real world. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of formulas that people are going to forget. I don't know, Saul, what do you think about that? You're an exemplar of not giving the answer, not saying what your view is, and having the students develop their own views, right?
Yeah, I'll give you two sorts of examples here. In my own class, let's say on Russian novelists, I teach, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy from their point of view. If I say something from the modern world to illustrate it, it's the sort of thing they would pick. If they want to know what I think about, morality or, their social concerns or religion, I won't tell them. I'm not important. What they need to do is get into the head of a genius who thinks differently. And I'll do the same with their characters, who all are described in a given point of view. And that way they learn to think in different ways. It broadens them. Where if I just told them what the truth is, why read the book at all? But on the other side, I think from talking to my students who are science majors, that science is really badly taught, because it's typically taught as a series of dogmas which are true and which are known. But that's not what science is. That's what catechisms are, okay? They ought to be teaching the process. Well, what experiment established this? What were the alternatives? Why were those alternatives not the right one? What might dislodge the present one? Then you see science as a process, and you also see that some theorems of science are much more firmly established than others, much less likely to change than others. If someone, speaks of science, we see these signs on the lawns that says, "I believe in science." It's like they're taking it as one whole block that can't be questioned.
Yeah.
You don't believe in science, and you don't believe in the Pythagorean theorem. It's not something you believe it. If you say that, you haven't understood science. But I think a lot of when you teach science classes as a series of theorems that you just must memorize and apply, you have really done a disservice to the understanding of science.
Yeah, I mean, it has become, as you know, a big problem, the confirmation and conformation biases in science, right? It's, I don't know, Marty, it's a lot easier to get tenure if you conform to the system. or if you confirm what has already been established. If you go to the fringes, it's a lot more difficult to actually make it in education. And so is the system sort of set up in this way?
Yeah, I'm actually not so sure that, what you said is true. I mean, I know people say that, but it depends on what kind of an institution you're talking about. The vast majority of the 4,000 colleges and universities in this country, you know, are teaching, undergraduate teaching institutions. They're not research institutions. So,
Yeah.
are you really publishing papers that confirm what other people had already done or not? So, I mean, you're really just talking about a very small number. There's only 63 great public and private research universities in this country, a signified membership in the American Academy of Universities, AAU, Association of American Universities, excuse me. And I think most of us, really do look for innovation. I mean, I know Saul was going to be a physicist before, as an undergraduate at Yale, I fell in love with literature, but, I've always been an economist. I have some people in my department here and other departments I've been in who, they are not just doing other people's footnotes. I mean, they are really, really innovative. In fact, one of my Kellogg colleagues had the lead article in the American Economic Review, our top journal, 2 months in a row, actually, this has happened. And they are professors of strategy, not of econometrics or anything. They were very technical papers, but they were really innovative papers, which is why they were on the cover, that lead article in AER. So, I don't really buy into this. I don't know what you think, Saul, that, somehow the process of getting tenure at the relatively small number of top research universities somehow stifles innovation. I haven't seen it in my field, certainly. I don't know, Saul, if you've seen it in yours.
No, I don't think that that's the issue. I think at all levels, you can be more open to different opinions or less. And, in a period like now when opinion is much more restricted and narrow, of course it is for getting tenure, but it's also for after tenure. So I don't think the problem is, what you have to do to get tenure.
Yeah. No. We obviously criticize ourselves, really badly sometimes. Graduate education in the U.S. is the best in the world. We have the best researchers in the world, and so if we are not doing it properly, I don't think the rest of the world is doing it properly. So, but I sometimes felt that there is a tendency toward normalization. There's a tendency toward falling in place to the average. But it sounds like Saul, you don't share that.
I don't share that there's a tendency to push towards the average. Well, there's always a return to the mean everywhere. So I guess that there's a sense in which that's true. There's certain things that if you want to play it safe, you can do to, get promoted and get tenure. And, I know people who do that, and that's really all they care about. But that's a temperamental thing. That means that what's top on your mind, is getting a sinecure. And there are a lot of people who are like that in every field. But it's also, in academia, it could be that you just have a passionate desire for the truth, in which case, you might not go the current way. Those are kind of temperamental kind of things, right? I mean, there'll always be people of both sorts.
Yeah, so I want to go to an area in the book, Divided We Stand, The Politics of Hate. Depending on your perspective, some people went through a traumatic experience last 4 years. Others went through a traumatic experience 8 years before that. Mm-hmm. But it is clear that we have 330 million people and 165 million people voting. it is clear that we have a blue bucket and a red bucket, and there is no transference between those buckets, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. What worries me is, how many of my friends, when Trump was elected in 16, who said, I never met anybody who would ever vote for him. I was positive he was going to get trounced by Hillary Clinton. I can't understand it. And then, I've heard from people when part of the refusal from some to believe that he actually lost the election to Biden was that, I never met anybody who didn't love Trump. It's like the polarization is so extreme now.
Yeah.
And I have friends in England, many friends in academia, in particular, who still just can't believe the Brexit vote. I never knew anybody who would ever vote for pulling out of the EU, and it's that degree of shock indicates that dialogue is significantly lacking. And the other thing I would say is that if you take people from the far right, yeah, they hate the people on the progressives on the left and AOC and the squad and all that. But they seem to have special hate, not for the people 180 degrees different from them, but 90 degrees. It's the people who don't have the guts to have any views because they're compromisers, they're moderates. And I would say the same from the progressives. As much as they despise the people on the far right, they seem to have special scorn for people in the middle. And, we talk about that in some length in the book. And, it is pretty remarkable that the Bernie folks, in 16, some of them were proud to say they'd rather have Trump elected than Hillary Clinton because she was a liberal and not a progressive. And then, of course, during the nightmare of January 6th, the insurrection mob seemed more interested in killing Mike Pence than in Nancy Pelosi. Whoever would have guessed that? Well, that's what happens when you have fundamentalism run wild. The one thing they agree on is that the middle of the road is worthy of more contempt than even the people on the extremes. And that is, I got to say, that is really, really worrying. And again, the critics about, now President Biden, he's a compromise. His best friend was John McCain, and, as if that's evidence that there's something inherently wrong with him. And I think you can not be swayed by another's belief, but still have respect for that person. And I think that's what the middle tends to do.
Yeah, there used to be a saying in Texas that the only thing you find in the middle of the road is a white line and a dead armadillo.
I
never heard that. That's a great line.
but it's a matter of fact, actually. Yeah. So I find that very interesting. That I sometimes tell people that I don't really analyze policies based on if somebody's wearing a blue shirt or a red shirt. I want to listen to the policy. I want to look at the merits of that policy. Not saying I'm a great guy or anything like that, but that is how I think. But we don't have that anymore, is it? So, Morty, what you're saying is that if you are in the middle, you're going to get shot from both the left and the right because you are sort of the worst possible position.
Well, I'm afraid that is increasingly the case. And again, the book talks a lot about that. But, chapter 4 in economics, right? So it's my field here, but Saul, of course, wrote a lot of it as well. We give example after example about economic policies to reduce carbon use, to, dealing with student loans, to dealing with tax rates, to dealing with healthcare, minimum wage, you name it. There's so much agreement. We have extensive literature that is apolitical. And in some cases, I believe the evidence is very clear. The minimum wage should be $15 an hour, and that's a progressive view, not a living wage necessarily, but a progressive view. I also believe that the Green New Deal is a tremendous mistake because of the excesses in it that diverts us from the true necessity of dealing with climate change. So, some would say, oh, he's a progressive. Some would say he's a conservative. Well, I try as much as possible as an economist to look at the data and make that decision. And my aim is not to feel good about myself because I'm in a particular camp, but, to be as most effective as possible. And so I can give many examples also from the book in other fields where that's what we argue. That's what we should all be trying to do.
So Saul, it seems to me that being in the middle is a risky position. So the Gen Z population that both of you teach, they should have a preference to go to the extremes, right? Because that appears to be the safe place to be.
Yes, although I try to ask my students, well, if you're advocating a particular policy, let's say to alleviate poverty, do you want it to alleviate poverty in the best way? Or do you want to feel good for advocating a position that is supposed to alleviate poverty? Because if you want the first, then you not only don't close out counter evidence or other views, you look for them because you're not guaranteed to have the perfect policy. Most policies fail in practice. You want to prevent that. You want to find out in advance. You want to get and change your policy to make it work better.
Yeah.
But there's a question then. You have to decide which it is your goal. And if you rule out counter evidence, then what you're basically saying is, I don't care whether it works. I care that I am with the good guys.
Yeah. Yeah. So Saul, I know that you do some work in the pre-university arena too. Do we have a problem with sort of the basic education in the US? It seems to me that the most fundamental thing about education is the ability to take information, analyze it, and question it.
Yeah.
Do we do that in the high school arena?
I'm not an expert on the high school arena. I can only judge from the the students that I wind up gone through it.
Yeah.
And my impression is there's been a change over the 35 years I've been teaching at Northwestern, in one good change and one bad one. In the STEM fields, the students come in knowing a lot more than they did 35 years ago.
Yeah.
In the humanities, in history, in anything like that, they come in knowing much, much less. They don't know how to write English very well in most, the way they do. They don't know basic grammar. Their knowledge of history is much poorer. And their idea of what a social view is a dogmatic view that they've been taught. Not everybody, of course. I'm just saying there's more of a tendency so that the quality of education they get in the humanities is less, and the quality in the hard sciences and mathematics is better.
Yeah. But then are you also saying, Saul, then, in some sense, the humanities education need to be more prescriptive?
Why prescriptive? I mean,
so in the STEM education, most of what we teach in the high school, is more about sort of deterministic physics, chemistry, biology stuff that cannot be refuted. Whereas, I don't know much about humanities, by the way, Saul, so I'm just making this thing up. But in humanities, the scope of thought has to be a lot broader, right?
Well, yes. I mean, I tend to think that the function, let me just focus on one part of humanities. What I know best is the teaching of literature. But you can apply this to history too. The main thing you want to get across is that people in different cultures and different centuries saw the world genuinely differently. And the way you look at their points of view, they look at yours. And you do not lie. It's not as if your point of view is guaranteed to be right forever. People 10 years ago might have thought the same, and you're going to look stupid 10 years from now. You do not live at what you believe may seem right to you, but that's because you haven't thought of other things. Humanities ought to teach you what it's like to think differently. Great novels will show you people from different social classes, different, periods, different psychologies, different religions, value sets. History, if you teach it correctly, will not be us judging them. It will be understanding the world, projecting yourself into, let's say, 18th century France, and see, what did they believe? What did they see? What was their view of the world? And what riches does it have for us that we may have lost? Not just where is it different from us, they're wrong. How does the way they see things that sometimes are smarter than what we see? They're different. In any case, you want to start out by understanding the difference, and then you no longer will have the idea that your little island in, space and time, Americans in a certain social class, in a certain set of professions, in a certain year, that's the truth. You will simply not have that view. You will know it's one of many.
Right. So Marty, I know that you have worked outside the U.S. in many, many places with the World Bank. And I'm wondering now, what are the characteristics that makes you gravitate toward the blue bucket and the red bucket? My own experience has been that, as I mentioned, I grew up in South India. I went to the adjacent state to get an engineering education. And out of there, I flew directly into Evanston. Nobody told me Chicago and Evanston is going to be this cold. And in 30 days, my perspectives changed. And so is it because we don't really have a broad knowledge, perspective, understanding that pushes us into this blue and red bucket problem that we have?
I think there's always going to be some expertise that everyone has, but most of the time we rely on experts, the talking heads on the TV and the like. And, I think that's always been the case. And, but the difference now is, you get a view and then you just have it reinforced and not challenged by the media with which you engage. And I think that's very different. And you mentioned that, development economics used to be one of my fields. I did, some serious travel and a little bit as a consultant for the World Bank in the 80s. And, I think what I came out from, that experience was, if you ever try to do work in other countries, if there's anything that gives you intellectual humility, that's it. Because you don't speak the native languages, you don't understand the culture, you don't usually understand the religion, you don't understand the literature, you don't understand the politics, but yet the temptation, of course, is to take your individual Western perspective and just apply it. And, people who know much more about the disappointing experience in the developing world over the last 4 or 5 decades, Joe Stiglitz and people, Nobel Prize winners like that, they speak to this one set of, prescriptions fits all. And, in my field, economics, you know what it is the government gets rid of subsidies. You support exports, you don't replace imports, you float the currency. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things. And there are general guiding principles that Saul and I write about in this book and our previous book that, seem to be true, but there's no definitive set of economic policies that guarantee, economic growth rates of the kind that some Asian countries and even now more recently some African countries have. So, what I learned from that experience was that you should listen more than you speak. And if you think that culture doesn't matter, you are wrong.
Yeah. So, Modi, I was talking to another academic the other day, and I just learned from that conversation that 2.7 billion people out of the 8.3 billion that we have cook over a kerosene-fired open flame, and it has a deleterious effect on their health. 2.7 billion,
Mhm.
one third of the world population. And, I cannot just internalize that, right? So, we talk about all sorts of things in the academic world, but there is some basic things missing that we can't really do anything about.
Well, I think we're, I don't know what that number used to be. And of course, I mean, I have no reason to doubt that this person was correct. I actually do think it's a little overestimated, but this
Yeah.
is not my expertise. But, you know, whatever that number is, it's larger than it should be. And in addition to health, I mean, it has a devastating impact on climate change, as we know. But that said, I mean, you don't have to be Steve Pinkner or one of these other people to say the world is like much better off. If you look at the number of people who live on, $2 a day or $2.50 a day in extreme poverty, it's a fraction of what it used to be. I mean, particularly as a percentage, but even in absolute terms. So, I wouldn't throw up my hands there. I mean, I think that there has been a rising tide that's helped many, many. And yeah, I mean, global inequality is higher. And that's simply because the richer countries have gotten richer faster than the poorer countries have gotten rich, right? So, if you're talking about absolute standards of living, by virtually any measure, the world is so much better than it was 10 or certainly 20 or 30 years ago. But the relative inequality, which matters also for a whole bunch of good reasons we talk about in the book, actually,
Yes.
that has been exacerbated, in this country since 1979, where there's been a tremendous increase in inequality of wealth and of income, back to the point now where the last time we've had, the top 1% or 5 or 10% own this percentage of America was back in 1928, before the onset of the Great Depression. So all the progress between 1929 and 1979 in this country, 50 years, was wiped out very quickly. And very similar story started a couple of years later in England and many countries still in the EU. But yeah, I think it's important to distinguish between absolute poverty, which you're alluding to, and relative poverty. In absolute poverty, we've made tremendous strides that we should recognize.
Yeah, I think that's true. Sometimes you think about sort of the aggregate development, aggregate wealth, but the relative aspects of it's quite important, right? So, I mean, we are seeing this in the U.S. 50% of the country doesn't have enough retirement money that they can, reasonably retire. And then 1% of the country has, 99% of the GDP that we create, including all the money going into the COVID-19 checks that all ends up in Amazon or someplace like that. So we have a real problem in sort of relative aspects of wealth, or not just wealth, but utility distribution. Do we have a solution for that?
Well, we argue in chapter 4 in Minds Wide Shut that, yeah, there are a lot of solutions for it. As I said before, economists agree on, what tax rates for the most part should be, particularly the highest marginal tax rate, before you get a serious backward bend in a labor supply curve, serious labor disincentives. People agree for the most part on what the minimum wage should be. They agree on, carbon policies, healthcare. I mean, it's the old joke you might know this old joke from President Truman, who said, what I really want is an economic advisor with one arm. And they said, well, why is that? And they said, because all my economists say, on one hand, you should do this, Mr. President. On the other hand, you should do this. I want somebody with one arm and only one hand. Well, we have one hand, I got to tell you, because, there are some things like the wealth tax, to be fair, and certain nuances of changing the Affordable Care Act, we argue in the book. But there's a lot of agreement, and, the market fundamentalists on one side, or the market, it's a misreading of Adam Smith, as we argue at length in the book, Wealth of Nations, 1776, never said that people are only, motivated by selfishness and their own individual monetary greed, nor that markets left alone, laissez-faire, always serve the public good. But yet that's the founding document for market fundamentalists, that, government can't get anything right, leave the markets. And then now there's this emerging, particularly generational emerging of market anti-market fundamentalists, that the real problem is endemic in capitalism, and somehow you need a planned economy or you're never going to address the ills of the world. And people thought that idea of a planned economy was banished to the dustbin of history, as we argue in the book. And it is kind of surprising, and I would say very worrying, that it's come back.
Yeah.
So
I would just say that in addition to all the problems with, economic equality, both income and wealth, is a kind of cultural inequality. That is, not just things like the distribution of, education and opportunities, but the sense that some people have that they are simply superior people, and the others are just too stupid to realize that they are being looked down upon, where they know perfectly well. And, my guess is a lot of the reason that, a lot of people voted for Trump is that they felt, when you call people deplorables, when and that was the most explicit. It was everywhere, the jokes of Samantha Bee, are all about, these knuckle dragging people who interbreed, right? That thing, it's very, if you really believe in equality and democracy, you do not treat some people as subhuman. And,
right.
That's part of what you get when you get silos. You get elites who don't even realize they're insulting other people.
Yeah.
But they are, and that become that. And if these people are already feeling, economically pressed, and then, to blame them for being bad people for some elite standard, you're asking for an explosion. And you don't have to do it that way.
Yeah. I mean, words have consequences, especially if you know words. So we'll take a quick break, Saul. We'll come back. We'll talk more about your book and religion and other areas.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So we're back. We are talking about Minds Wide Shut, how the new fundamentalisms divide us, by Saul Morson and Morton Schapiro from Northwestern. Saul, one of the chapters in the book is about religion, and religion has become sort of a loaded word in the Western world. And so fundamentalism is typically associated with the term religion, but we talked about all sorts of fundamentalisms before, but religion still remains to be an issue, right, from a fundamentalist perspective?
Well, the fundamentalist view as we describe it, the closure to evidence and certainty, was certainly true in certain religious groups, still is, but it's just as likely to be true in non-religious groups, and particularly in a secular age. Instead of speaking of, a revelation from God, you say science told me. It has the same, it has the same force and you jump to it as rapidly. And there are open-minded people in religion and outside of religion too. I don't think although the term comes from the religious fundamentalists, the two styles of thinking we're talking about are as likely to be true among the religious and the secular.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Marty, you mentioned that you're a religious person, and you look at it that way. But at Northwestern, I would imagine, with all the scientists and engineers and technologists around, it's a very secular place, isn't it?
Less so than you might think. And I think it has to do with the Midwest. And, as a student and as a parent here, that, Midwestern values, so to speak, are, not just an intellectual humility and civility and, less taken with yourself, less entitled and the like. But there's also more of a faith-based communities. And, I've been at a number of secular colleges and universities, and the faith-based communities here are very strong, whether for the Jews or the Catholics or the Muslims or the Hindus, and on and on and on. And we have chaplains for all the different groups, and it's a very important part of life here. And there's also, I have to say, quite a number of STEM folks that, who never miss a mass at the Catholic Center, or are very actively engaged along with me at Hillel for the Jews. And so, I think, there's the view that somehow, people of faith are just people who are superstitious. As a person of faith, I obviously reject that. And I think there's an open-mindedness on our campus that, I don't think students, faculty, and staff are as defensive about their faith as they might be at other secular schools.
Yeah, I'll show my bias, Marty. I grew up as a Catholic in South India. I consider myself to be an agnostic now. Agnostics, I think, are what atheists call confused atheists, I suspect. But agnosticism gives me a lot of flexibility. But why do you think religion is important?
Well, I think, we all need some sort of thing to ground us on morality and give us a serenity and trying to look at the best of the human values. And I think, some people get it from loving nature. Some people get it from whatever it is. And, I'm not one of these people of faith who feel like I found the answer and nobody else did. Saul has a very different relationship with faith and God than I do. And that's fine. I love him. I literally do. And, for me, I couldn't survive. It's who I am. And, I always think that, particularly in my day job as a president, and when I'm having a tough time, I always think that, Shabbat is never more than 6 days away.
Yeah, so, as I was reading the book, I thought about, sort of my upbringing. This is a small state in South India.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very unique place. It has 20% Catholics, 35% Muslims, and the rest Hindus. It had a 5% Jewish population, which was there for 2,000 years. And it has 100% literacy and negative population growth rate, which, all metrics that are sort of unusual for a developing area. And religion for us was really parties. We went to every temple, we went to every church, every mosque. Every time there was, some sort of a festival, everybody participated in it. That might be now called cosmopolitanism. I don't know what the right term for it. So did we lose that idea now?
Well, my sense among students is that they are completely tolerant of, any religion or any religious disagreement, but for a very simple reason. They don't give a damn. It's very easy to be tolerant of something you don't care about, right?
Yeah.
So, when I came here, you would get people saying, "Oh no, I'm a Catholic. I would never marry a Protestant," right? And I remember growing up, and it was even like, "I'm an Irish Catholic. I would never marry an Italian Catholic."
Right.
I grew up in, but now, oh no, that doesn't matter. But I wouldn't marry someone from the other political party. That's absolutely impossible. So the same kind of prejudice is still there. It's just switched, So another way you could say this, there's a line I've thought of a lot from G.K. Chesterton, which is the problem with atheists is not that they believe in nothing, but that they are ready to believe in anything. And if you think of Marxism, Leninism, or Nazism, or other equivalent ideologies, Maoism or whatever, that's largely true. This need to believe, being a Jew or a Catholic, it's much less dangerous than what the alternatives would be likely to be.
Yeah, it is quite interesting, Saul. So, Amadi and Saul, this could be a field study for your book. Again, the place that I grew up, all the metrics that I told you, it's also the first democratically elected Marxist government in the world. It's pretty, it's 28 million people. Right after Indian independence, they elected a Marxist government to power. And I grew up reading all the Russian literature translated into my language. And unfortunately, Marty, Voice of America didn't really win in the propaganda war there. And so again, here is a sort of an experiment where you had religion, you had sort of political ideology, you had education all mixing together into some sort of an outcome. And, in your book, it's all about that, right? You have politics, you have religion, you have economics. So these domains sort of mixing with preconceived notions. But it seems to me that if you have an initial condition of an open mind, none of these things could matter.
Well, certainly having an open mind is something that we support as educators and as authors. And I mean, that's really what the book is about. The subtitle is How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us.
Yeah.
And you're talking about in a location and an era where you weren't all that divided. I assume you're talking about Kerala, or
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, I know Kerala actually pretty well. It's one of my favorite places in the world, so I have to take you there. No more beautiful places with the lakes and the dance and the cuisine. We love Kerala. So anyway, yeah, that's sort of heaven on earth, isn't it? But I don't know what it's like, how people raised there now or raised differently than you did, but having a mix of faiths and perspectives, is sort of what we dream about, but I think it's increasingly difficult to find in reality.
Yeah, the other side of the coin there, Marty, is that when I came to Evanston, I had a host family, Mr. and Mrs. McCulloch. They both passed away now, out on Central Street. And, as I mentioned, I came to Evanston right from South India without ever going outside my state or the two adjacent states. And so I didn't know what to expect, but in 30 days, they could acclimatize me to the US culture. And so, it is quite possible for anybody to think broadly.
If you're willing to, right?
If you're willing to. So Saul, I know that you have, done a lot of work in Russian literature. And, we're going through a scenario now that I don't know how many Americans really know Russia that well, but there is sort of a hate built up in the system. Do you think that's warranted?
Look, there are a lot of things that the Russian government does that are not in American interest or that are opposed to our values. But I think that what we're seeing is a hatred of Russia which goes beyond that, beyond what is reasonable, as if it were, a place to project our frustrations on, as as the enemy. In sort of in a way that we haven't seen since the McCarthy era. And in the McCarthy era, there was more reason than there is now. The Russians were much more dangerous then than they are now, and it was bad enough then. So being a student of Russian history, I will say that for all the reasons that we would not like the Russian government and Russian policy, by Russian standards, this government is as good as it gets.
Mm.
You don't have 10 million people in the gulag. A scholar can publish a book that doesn't propagate the party line. It could be about something completely apolitical. You couldn't do that in the Soviet Union. Everything, there was not just negative censorship, there was positive censorship. You had to say certain things, right? Indeed, you could probably even criticize Putin as long as it was in a scholarly book that can be read by 300 people. Who cares, right? None of that is true in the Soviet period. It's, you can travel abroad if you have the money, which you certainly couldn't do, back then. By Russian standards, this is really, it's not going to get any better. I'm sorry to say,
Things are improving. Marty,
they're improving, but they're not as bad as they were.
No, okay, not as bad as they were. So, Marty, in the book, you have sort of a path forward, and you talk about a return to dialogue. Is that what we are missing in this country? Are we missing a dialogue, a debate, a way to take your ideas and show why that might be wrong?
Yeah, that's what sort of the book, as you know, is about. But Saul and I have a little different view about how optimistic we should be about achieving that. I'm encouraged by the fact that we did elect a moderate who takes pride in compromise and respecting both sides and listening to both sides, and that makes me encouraged. I don't know whether we're going to get out of our echo chambers, but not having a president who throws gasoline on every little fire is certainly makes it a little better.
Yeah.
So I'm more optimistic now. I know Saul, maybe because of his expertise in Russian history, is not always that sanguine. I mean, people talk about, it's a pendulum and it comes back, and we talk about in the book, is that really true? And so you worry about that pendulum coming back, right? Is it really a pendulum? Is that the right metaphor, right?
Yeah,
So
I heard somebody say, "Oh yes, they're censoring points of view they don't like. They're trying to, eliminate the independent, the court, which would guarantee our, civil liberties against a majority government." Yes, but that's temporary because the pendulum will swing back. And I thought about this for a day when I heard it, and I said, how do you know it's a pendulum? What if that's the wrong metaphor? What if it's a snowball coming downhill? You don't know what the right metaphor is, right? And the history of, of polarized, radicalized societies, let's say during the French and, Revolution, during Russia, starting about 1900, is an once this process of intolerance starts, it accelerates. And nothing will stop it until there's a countervailing force. And in the case of, in the French Revolution, you got it eventually with Napoleon, right? But you didn't get you never got it with the Russian Revolution, right? So unless there's going to be that countervailing force, it will push as far as it can. intolerance breeds on intolerance. And it could switch sides so that instead of having, a left-wing intolerance, you get a right-wing intolerance. That's entirely possible, right? The idea is, well, if they did it, we're justified in doing it too, and we'll do it even more, which I think is entirely possible, right? And then it could go back again. But intolerance breeds upon itself on both sides.
Yeah. And so, Saul, I want to finish up with Chekhov. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Oh, yeah, right, Chekhov.
Chekhov. So Anton Chekhov was perhaps the greatest short story writer, you say, who ever lived. At Enemies, 1887, is exemplary of his work. In some 20 pages, only 5,000 words, he explores where the lack of dialogue and the failure of empathize may lead. We are seeing this all around the country today. We have a lack of dialogue and possibly a failure to empathize. So I know that it is clear where that might lead, but do we have some sort of a preventative interaction we could attempt?
You mean to make things better?
To make things better.
Yes, I think, I am pessimistic, but I'm not hopeless. People can make a choice that, well, we want to empathize with people we disagree with. We want to see it from their point of view. We want to treat them like real people, not like, enemies.
Yeah.
The chair title. And, things are not in stone. People have choices. Cultures have choices. They could choose, to make the other choice. Maybe Morty's right that, in some respects, we're doing it right now. I hope so. And I think, empathy, not just emotional, but intellectual with people who think differently. That's Chekhov's supreme value in all his stories is empathy. And I think it's what great literature is about, because you see the world from the perspective of, characters who are unlike yourself, you identify with them. That is what, is what we most need right now, intellectual and emotional empathy with those unlike, and cultural with those unlike ourselves.
Yeah, so Marty, I want to close with you. After a long career at Northwestern, you have announced that you're stepping down from the president of Northwestern. Are you coming back home to the Northeast?
I'll tell you something. I get asked that a lot. I really, I still have 16 months. And and it's hard to believe. I have no idea what we're going to do, where we're going to live. I mean, my wife and I'm just working on getting the graduation ceremonies in a COVID world, getting them together, ready to prepare for the new normal, for research and teaching and everything else in the fall. And then, we have searches for athletic director or dean of the law school. I mean, I just working around the clock, and probably maybe in a year from now or something, we'll have to think about where we're going to live. It won't be in a president's house, but we're really not focused on it now, to be honest with you.
Yeah. This has been excellent. The book is Minds Wide Shut: How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us. I really enjoyed reading this book. I have to say, Marty, when I was there at Northwestern in the mid-'80s, they used to give us free tickets to go see the cats, but things have improved a little bit, looks like.
Well, the students still get them. So as you know, your daughter, the undergrads all get free tickets. I think we're the only school in the Big Ten that gives free entry to all athletic events to all of our undergrads. I hope we keep that, even though we win a lot more than when you were here.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks for
our pleasure. Be well.
Thank you.
Be well. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.